Awesome. All right. Hey, everyone. My name is Dwayne David Paul, and I'm here with Ifetayo Harvey of the People of Color Psychedelic Collective. Um, and yeah, we're just going to have a conversation about psychedelics, about politics, about public policy. In particular, we're going to use an article that Ifetayo wrote for the Fordham Law Review on abolishing the DEA, kind of as like as like a site of conversation and analysis. But and I will link to that in whatever posts that goes up, so you all can read that as well. So thanks for coming on. Can you like introduce yourself a little bit?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. I'm Ifetayo. I am the executive director of the People of Color Psychedelic Collective. We are an organization that does education and community building for people of color interested in psychedelics, interested in learning more about them, their cultural origins, their therapeutic potential. And we educate people on how and why we should end the war on drugs. So we've been around, started as like an informal project back in 2017, and we evolved into a nonprofit a couple years later. So yeah, we do everything from partnerships, collaborations. We've had a conference. We've also, produced, many of our own events, panels, some healing events. So yeah, that's a little bit about me.
Nice. I guess I'm wondering, before we jump into your essay, just like a little bit about your background and, how and why you like got into this work. Yeah.
Yes. So I got into this work because I started sharing my story of growing up with my father in prison. And ultimately, my father was deported after serving about 8 years in prison. My father sold drugs and was on the run for about a decade. And in that decade, I was born, my younger brother was born. And when I was about four, my dad went away to prison. He was incarcerated in Florida. I grew up in South Carolina. And I started as an intern at the Drug Policy Alliance back in 2013, sharing my story of what it's like to be a child of an incarcerated parent. I published an op-ed in a few outlets called Children of Incarcerated Parents Bear the Weight of the War on Drugs. And so this process of sharing my story has been a part of my healing journey, and also just helping me understand that even though I felt very alone in my experience, as someone who is a child of an incarcerated or formerly incarcerated person, I realized that this is a much larger phenomenon than I initially thought. I think the statistics are 1 in 28 children have a parent in prison. And I think for Black children, it's 1 in 9. So this is an issue that's important for me because when we send someone to prison, we don't always think of how it impacts the family, how it impacts children, um, and the larger community. So I started sharing my story. And in 20 later that year in 2013, Drug Policy Alliance invited me to speak at their opening plenary of their conference, the International Drug Policy Reform Conference. And I'm a person who kind of prides myself on being comfortable with public speaking. But during that talk, I actually, broke down in tears crying because saying those things out loud about my father just kind of hit me different. And after that talk, a lot of people came up to me and thanked me and told me they related to the story that I shared, whether they were the parent who was incarcerated or whether they were the child that, lost their parent to incarceration. And at that time, I got diagnosed with major depressive disorder. I was in therapy, and I was hit with a depressive episode. This was my senior year of college, and at this conference, I went to a panel on end of life treatment and psychedelics. Um, and I knew about psychedelics. I never tried them, but this panel kind of convinced me to give mushrooms a shot because I was prescribed, Wellbutrin, and I wasn't super comfortable or ready to do that. So I wanted to explore some alternative options. And so hearing about how terminal cancer patients and other folks who are in the process of dying, how they found healing in psychedelics, that resonated with me. And after that conference, I went back to school and asked my friends how to do mushrooms, and they gave me the lowdown on how to do them. And so I did, and it obviously changed the trajectory of my life.
Oh,
And after I graduated, I bounced around from different jobs. And about a year after I graduated, I started working at the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, also known as MAPS. And they do clinical research. Their primary focus is MDMA assisted psychotherapy for people with PTSD. And so they're like one of the leading organizations in the psychedelic field. And so that's what kind of led me to start my own organization. After working for them for about 8 months, I gained a lot of experience and knowledge about the field, but there were also a lot of glaring issues, right? There wasn't a lot of diversity in the staff. I was the only Black person on staff at the time. And even within their research, I recall one time the clinical team was doing a presentation and they were going over the demographics from one of their studies, and it was like 90% white of their subjects. So it didn't seem like they had people who looked like me in mind when they were doing this research. And I just started connecting with other people who saw these issues. I wrote a piece in a magazine called Symposia called Why the Psychedelic Community is So White, and that got a lot of traction. And so that led to, a group organizing on Zoom, having these kinds of discussions on Zoom, and that evolved into us doing projects together.
thank you for that. And you touched on so much. You know, I think I'd like to like go to the sort of contextualize like the very beginning. For the longest time, I used to like hate the term war on drugs because it just seemed to convey so much of the like perverse like politics and morality of like the people who construct these things. But as I've like gotten older and like gotten involved in some like organizing and policy work, it's apt, right? In the way that um that wars produce such like far-reaching casualties,
Mm.
right? And like the way that there are sort of like there's like frontline harms, but the ripple effects throughout communities, the way that like that violence reverberates,
Mm.
like through our families and through our neighborhoods, um, for a long time, my older brother was involved in the justice system and in the criminal legal system and just like in and out of prison. And I saw the way that like that way the way that like shaped my family, shaped like our relationships, our neighborhoods. I grew up in Brooklyn, uh before you could find a latte, in Brooklyn. Um and like just the way that like that shaped like so many of our expectations, like walking around, like through school, walking by or around cops, like um and so like yeah, like that really resonates with me um as like a part of a starting point, for engaging in this. And so I guess like with that in mind, um and we'll definitely double back to like the other things that you touched on, particularly around like the lack of the like erasure of people of color from like psychedelic spaces, and and so many other things. But um so I reached out because you wrote this like awesome essay. uh I think it was titled "It's Time to Abolish the DEA," which is like immediately exciting, um, uh, and so I think it's important to start as like concrete as possible, right? So um, when before we get to like imagining what's possible, so the you outlined this really well, right? Like the Drug Enforcement Agency is a failure on its own terms,
Hmm.
right? Instead of curbing drug use and trafficking, the DA strategies, quote, have led to skyrocketing overdose rates, spillover violence, more power for drug cartels, and the agency's abuse of its power. And so I'm wondering if we could kind of start there, because uh, it is such an expansive agency, and has such a huge scope, but it's also just like invisible from people's day-to-day lives. And so if you could kind of touch on, I guess like we could start with like the failures in this like we're in 2025, 65-year-old war, right? Like maybe we could start there.
Yes, yes. So I think, what you just said, we've been in this 65-year war, and if the DEA was actually effective as an agency, then we wouldn't still be in this so-called war, right? Um, and we've seen a steady increase in overdose deaths, um, a steady increase in people using substances in general. So, part of my argument is, like you said, the DEA is failing on their own terms instead of, or they're failing on their own terms of curbing drug use, keeping people safe from drug use. Um, so yeah, they're failing at it because their methods don't work, right? Criminalization does not curb drug use. If you talk to anyone who's been to prison, especially like high population prisons, they'll tell you you can access drugs in prison. If you talk to people who have been in the drug game, they'll tell you that cops sell and use drugs too. So I think there's this idea that the DEA is fighting these bad guys, and it's like cops and robbers when they've always been behind. And I think, something we have to consider is that the DEA was built on a false premise, right? In my essay, I talked about how Richard Nixon and his cabinet knew that they were overblowing the whole drug problem, but it was kind of like, campaign fodder for them, right? We're going to look tough on crime. We're going to come down on these drug users who are ruining our cities and communities. When, if you look at the statistics from the 60s and 70s, cannabis use and heroin use were on the decline. So you have to wonder if them overstating this problem might have led to even a worsening of the problem itself, right? Um, and
And
oh,
I think you quote Nixon, where
mhm,
he notes like he says, quote, doubling the conviction rate in this country would do far more to cure crime in America than quadrupling the funds for Mr. Herbert H. Humphrey's War on Poverty. So like immediately, right? And this is like I think the quote's from like 68, right? And like immediately it's like juxtaposed to, this sort of what's said in the office behind closed doors, right, is like very much about like funneling resources, or at least like sort of human needs based resources, like away from like poor and like working class communities of color.
Yeah, yeah, he's basically admitting that, yeah, we know, poverty is a problem, but instead of actually solving that problem by helping people, let's just throw them in prison because we actually don't care about those people. And that's why I like that you mentioned earlier that, the term war on drugs is kind of like a misnomer because it's really a war on people. And there's this infamous quote by John Ehrlichman, one of Nixon's members or cabinet members, who says like, yeah, we knew it was about the drugs. This was an easy way to criminalize Black people, people who were against the Vietnam War, and any other adjacent groups. It was never about the drugs. And so that's why in my piece I say that, not only is the DEA corrupt, and there's so many receipts showing that the DEA is corrupt, um, so many stories of their agents selling drugs or, endangering informants' lives. The idea of drug use as a problem is a social construct because people have been using drugs forever. Um, and so framing it as a problem kind of creates more problems where there weren't as many. So I guess you could look at it, going back to that Nixon quote. Okay, you acknowledge that there's poverty, and there's the solution is to end poverty, right? Give people more resources, food, clothing, and shelter, make that more accessible. But instead of that, no, actually, let's perpetuate the problem and continue it and criminalize people, because poverty is maybe profitable or criminalization is profitable. Um, so yeah.
Yeah, I think so there's like immediately kind of a coupling of, of uh, you know, poverty, and the criminalization of drug use. And so I guess I want to like invert that. I get the sort of the DEA's and law enforcement's vision of like how we ought to relate to, basic human needs as well as like drug use, right? But when you talk about abolishing the DEA, like I don't get the sense that there's just meant to be a vacuum there, right? Like there's a constructive vision, you know, that you've already alluded to, right? Talking about like alleviating poverty, and I think elsewhere you kind of spell out. And so I guess I'm wondering, like, one, you know, um, fill in that sort of vacuum, like abolish the DEA and do what? Or and then two, like, how if we're not relating to drugs, we as a society aren't relating to drugs as like criminalizing them. What's how does society in your vision like relate to drugs
Mhm. Mhm.
ideally, right?
Yeah, yeah. So, well, there's a few things. I think ultimately we do have to address drug use. Um, and I'll say that there's a difference between drug use and addiction, and a lot of times they get conflated. And I'm so grateful for the work of Dr. Carl Hart for really, hammering this point that most people who use drugs do not get addicted, right? But for that small minority of people who do get addicted, we need to get to the heart of the issue. And, Dr. Hart, what he says is that most people struggle with addiction because they're struggling with some unresolved pain or trauma, right? People aren't addicted to drugs just because the drugs are fun. um, it's usually because we don't have a societal social safety net to help people when they are dealing with trauma in their lives, right?
Mhm.
So many people's stories I've read over the years or interviewed who've gone to prison, they usually have suffered some kind of trauma early on in life. And not only that, but they did not have the resources to heal from their trauma. And so that's, to me, that's not a coincidence, right? So that's why I think harm reduction is so important. And harm reduction is like a philosophy of we should keep people alive, right? As opposed to telling people you need to get off drugs before you can get help or before you can get better. It's about meeting people where they're at and reducing the risk associated with drug use. So that can look like educating people about naloxone, um, giving people fentanyl test strips, um, telling people other practices they can use to keep themselves safe when using drugs, right? That's a start. The other thing is we have to actually improve society. We have right? Because I think there's this notion that, doing these harm reduction things is enough. And it's like, no, our society is still very much broken. Um, we don't have good healthcare in this country. When you talk about mental health care, we don't have good mental health care in this country.
What's that?
It's not affordable to the average person. It's not accessible. There's not enough therapists to go around, especially
Right.
for people of color. So, and then, you talk about housing, homelessness is increasing in the US. Um, Job security is like a non-existent thing for a lot of people. Wages are ridiculously low given, the price of most things. So we have to build a society that's centered around care. And so that starts with implementing harm reduction principles and meeting people's needs around mental health care, housing, food. Um, and I think there are examples that we can look at because when, I say this or other people say this, people think like, oh no, the sky's going to fall if we decriminalize drug use, right? And criminalization has not worked. It doesn't work. It's not a solution. It's simply like it's not even a band-aid. It's like putting a dirty band-aid on a fresh wound. You're gonna get an infection.
Right. It is a bait and switch, right? Because I mean, so one of the reasons I'm really excited by your work and um is because like I mean just look at the like complexity and the sort of like clear analysis that you just offered compared to the fear mongering around drugs that I'm 39 in a couple weeks, right? So like I'm like peak this is your brain on drugs. Uh and you don't have to address poverty, right? You don't have to address housing. You don't have to address the education of medical and mental health professionals. You don't have to address the like wages if you can say like, well, the problem is the drug,
Mhm.
right? Like people's lives are falling apart because of like this like substance that we can imbue with like a kind of mana, right? It's a kind of like magical thinking, right? That like society is crumbling, not because people don't have their basic human needs met, but because of this like these like magical substances that and, imagine, right? Like um the sort of great and powerful United States of America that we could be like crushed by by these plants. You know, there is something like fantastical about this. Um, you know, as opposed to, you know, addiction as a fairly predictable adaptation,
Right.
right? To like unfortunate like circumstances and stimuli, right? Like, um, and I think like the sort of propaganda that we've received around drug use um, has like mystified our political analysis, right? Where like people, um, you know, in a way that sort of obscures the sorts of demands that we ought to be making of our government and of one another.
Mhm. Yes, exactly. It's like the points here and it just goes over everyone's head and we get stuck in these like weird echo chambers that yeah, just don't get to the heart of the problem. And it's frustrating because we've seen other countries take steps and the sky hasn't fallen. They've seen good results, not saying it's perfect. But there, there's countries like the Czech Republic, Portugal, that have taken steps to decriminalize drug use and just move away from that whole punishment focused paradigm that we're stuck in. And it's really about, it's as simple as care. We're so set on punishing people and making them feel bad when everyone, well, not everyone, but most people have used a drug or use drugs actively, whether that be alcohol, tobacco, or heroin or cocaine. It's just that we choose to stigmatize certain drugs over others. Um, so so yeah, I hope to see it. We're in a we're in a very difficult climate right now. With Trump and his administration saying they want to do like kill drug dealers and all this stuff, or they're blaming fentanyl for everything. Um, when it's much more complex and nuanced than that. So I think we have to, really get to the heart of the issue and stop letting these like, I don't know, these fake um problems cloud the solutions that we need to be implementing.
Yeah, and could you say something about fentanyl because it is like the sort of contemporary you know boogeyman,
Mhm.
right? Where like every few weeks there's a story of like you know some cop touched you know like had the wind he was like downwind of you know like a tic tac size or whatever of fentanyl and like his life is ruined now you know it is the and at the same time this like real persistent conjunction um you know between like these sort of the fear mongering around the drug of the day and xenophobia
Mhm.
right like you know the sort of the tariffs currently underway on like Canada and Mexico are positioned around not just like you know the drug trade but you know immigration, right?
Mhm.
And like the sort of the failure of Canada and Mexico to like um you know curb fentanyl coming into the country. So I'm just wondering like anything you have to say around that because I think that like that is the um you know that's like the boogeyman right now. That's the thing I think people are seeing these like horrific and sensational headlines about.
Yeah. Yeah. So fentanyl is a powerful opioid, right? And historically, it has been used in medical settings. Um, I forget the exact statistic. I think it's like 30 times more powerful than heroin. So when it's used in a medical setting, you use way less. Basically, a little goes a long way, right? And there is a lot of hysteria around fentanyl because I would say in the past 9 or 10 years, we've been seeing the drug supply cut with fentanyl, heroin, other opioids, even sometimes cocaine. And the police, they perpetuate these myths about fentanyl, right? You talked about how you'll see these headlines, a cop touched fentanyl and they almost died, when that's not actually possible. You can't touch fentanyl and get high from it, or overdose from it. Like, it has to go into one of your mucous membranes, like your nose, your mouth. And so that was a big thing that a lot of drug reform advocates had to push back on, right? Why are the police perpetuating these lies? And ultimately keeps people unsafe when we're miseducated about drug use. And there is this like conflation of fentanyl and homelessness when we talk about a lot of major cities nowadays. But I wanted to share this article that came out in the LA Times recently about a study that was done that shows that most people, um, the majority of homeless people in California aren't illicit drug users. So I think, you know, the fentanyl hysteria and, the increase in overdose deaths that we are seeing um, were shaped by fentanyl. But again, we have to look at the core of the issue. How is this substance infiltrating our drug markets? And why isn't the DEA able to stop them, right? And the DEA is not some small agency. They have offices in 90 countries around the world. So if they have all this funding, all this infrastructure, they should be able to do more to stop fentanyl. I'm not.
Yeah, there are like 10,000. So yeah, I got super curious. I was like, well, how big is it?
Mhm.
And there's like 10,000 staff members, and their budget in 2021 was $3.28 billion,
Yep.
with like 5 or 6 thousand special agents.
Mhm.
Um, and it's like, damn, uh, if you were doing a good job on your own terms, it feels like we should be winding this thing down by now, rather than constantly building it up.
Right.
I guess like the last thing I want to touch on is you shared in the beginning of sort of your story and your introduction to mushrooms, um and as well as how like um that space is incredibly white in the US, um which feels like such a shame, right? Because like the use of consciousness altering substances is just like cross-cultural, right? And like has like such a rich history up and down the Americas and on the land that we occupy. And so I guess I'm wondering like um you know how are folks, um could you say a bit more about like how folks are pursuing like individual and communal healing through the use of psychedelics, and even like tapping into what's sacred, because that also seems to be like a fairly common like cross-cultural phenomenon as well, like the use of psychedelics in something of like a spiritual kind of setting. And I'm sort of wondering um about any and all of that you want to touch on, and also like how like I've seen like a bunch of the programs that you all are doing at People of Color Psychedelics Collective, like how are y'all pursuing that as well?
Mhm. Yeah, so that's a great question. I think that, recently we've seen such a boom and interest and investment in the psychedelic field. And there's kind of this debate going on within the field of whether there should be more investment towards the medical clinical side versus the community grassroots side. And I think
Mm.
that because, people of color, we've experienced a lot of medical racism, a lot of classism, from doctors and, the medical field in general. A lot of us tend to gravitate toward the community grassroots side, doing it with friends or family, doing it on our own, maybe even going to a retreat. Um, I think each, trajectory has its plus and minuses, and it really depends on, what makes you feel safe. Um, I think that sometimes there's this notion that in order for your experience to be sacred, it has to be XYZ. And I don't think it's always so clear cut. Obviously, a lot of these substances come from indigenous cultures, right? Ayahuasca, peyote, iboga, those all come from indigenous cultures. Even mushrooms, or papayas, in the 50s and 60s, but they have their roots in indigenous cultures in Oaxaca, Mexico. So I do think, we should respect people's cultures, especially indigenous folks' cultures. There's a lot of indigenous people who are asking us to not use their substances, not to harvest their substances. Um, and they're also telling us that it's not just a substance, right? These
Mm.
medicines are ancestors, they're their kin. And so you have to build a relationship with them. And that, I think, challenges, Western understanding of plants and fungi, um, because we think of them as objects and not as beings or as teachers. So I think it's important to, keep that in mind, in regards to psychedelics. That said, I also think that there's a thin line between fun and sacred. And, if you're a person who has gone through a lot in life, who's dealt with a lot of trauma, having fun, giggling your ass off can feel very sacred or special,
For
Um,
sure.
and sometimes, that cliche, laughter is the best medicine, is so real for a lot of folks who haven't been able to experience that laughter. So, I encourage people, there's nothing wrong with ritualizing your experience. But there's also nothing wrong with having fun and just enjoying it with friends. If that's what you want to do. I think the most important thing is safety, harm reduction, um, making sure you're with people who you feel comfortable around, people that you trust, and that you're in a place where you feel comfortable. Um, I know you asked a few questions, so I hope that addressed most of it, but
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, yeah, like there were, this is very this is pretty sort of foreign to me, and so there were just like a bundle of curiosities that I had that I couldn't like I'm not skillful enough to untangle. So I'm just like I'm gonna throw everything out there and then you'll hit on the notes that you hit on and that'll be that.
yeah.
Um Perfect. Thank you for that. Yeah, is there thanks so much for your time. Where can folks find your work? And I'll also share like links and stuff when I send this out. But do you have anything coming up that you'd like to promote? Where can folks find your work, etc.?
Yes. So you can find us at our website, www.pocpc.org. There you can follow us on social media, sign up for our email newsletter. Upcoming events, we have an event coming up on 4/20. It's going to be an online event called Sacred Pathways, a journey through psychedelic care and healing modalities. So this event is going to be a combination of a panel discussion, and will also give attendees the opportunity to engage with healing practitioners while they guide you through, various healing modalities. We'll have breakout rooms and, space for people to kind of jump around and try different things. So we haven't published that event yet, but we will. So I'll make sure to send you that link once it's up and ready.
Awesome. Yeah, I can't wait to share it. Thanks again so much, Ifetayo. So,
Yeah.
yeah, thank you for coming on.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It was great talking.